Okay. I'm Sebastian,
And I'm Matthew.
and we are presenting on DNA methylation, and we're going to be talking about stress and social emotional health. So, why are we talking about this? So, in our brain trauma class, we learned a ton about the ACEs research, and while a part of that is we learned how tremendously positive of an impact that has had on research and kind of bridging the gap between medicine and psychology. We also recognize that there's kind of an unintended overshadow between these negative health outcomes and factors of resiliency. So part of this study, or part of this makes us question things like, so for my own case, I thought to myself, I have an ACE score of 8, but I have a pretty good life right now. What does that mean? So this kind of inspired some of our digging into this idea of how DNA methylation has a factor here in resiliency.
Yeah. So this topic is directly relevant to our work in counseling psychology for 2 reasons, and we're going to try to weave these 2 reasons, these 2 themes throughout our presentation. The first being that it's just important for us as professionals to know how to use our assessment tools, and more specifically how to use the ACEs research in our own practice. So in our work with clients, working from a trauma-informed model, it's just imperative that we understand the neurophysiology of trauma and how epigenetics is related to the development of a person. We need to understand these concepts just on a fundamental level in order to work effectively. The second part of this is that we also, while being able to hold theory, to understand research, and to have the ability to conceptualize and create models of understanding with clients as informed by ACE research, we also need to be flexible. We need to be critical, and we need to be able to hold the research and the person at the same time, and realize that people, our clients, are complex, that their histories are nuanced, and that we cannot just draw cause and effect conclusions based off of the sort of preliminary information we can gather through an ACE questionnaire. So we want to be able to embrace the complexity of that as we work with our clients.
Okay, so what is DNA methylation? So essentially what that is it's an epigenetic mechanism that occurs by the addition of methyl CH3 group to DNA nucleotides. So typically methylation looks like repression in gene expression. And actually I'll hand that over to you in a second. So in terms of relevance to our presentation, so what we're kind of looking at is these adverse childhood experiences that, or trauma, or just situations, the environment that create a lot of stress. It creates this epigenetic shift where DNA methylation occurs. And what the ACEs research does is it really highlights how this chronic toxic stress is correlated with these negative health outcomes and negative socio-emotional functioning. We really want to talk about how that while, yes, this is true, there's also this factor of resilience. And actually, methylation can be pretty important in the conversation about resilience, which can lead towards positive socio-emotional functioning and positive health outcomes.
Yeah, so what you're touching on there, the relationship between what is a positive health outcome, what is a negative health outcome. In terms of the research, we are not able to make those sorts of conclusions with just where we are as a field. But what we are able to clearly establish is that average childhood experiences will result in methylation in regions throughout the brain. This is just like a widespread phenomenon that we see in many studies. So when I'm speaking of methylation, I'm going to go through a literature review, pulling out two main studies in particular. We're talking about the process by which DNA is either raveled or unraveled by the addition or by taking away a methyl group, as shown. This is just a broad overview of that epigenetic process. So when I speak of the process of methylation, I'm referring to this methyl group in relation to the rest of the model. So if I can jump into the literature review, that's the good stuff. So yeah, so this is a great article that incorporates 130 studies published all within the last decade about how the epigenetic process of methylation occurs in response to adverse childhood experiences. So the research shows that certain regions of the brain respond more consistently to adverse childhood experiences. And broadly, we've identified stress genes and locations on those genes that are particularly that operate as identifiable factors that respond to traumatic experiences. So these are usually identified in the research as the NR3C1 and the CRH genes. So I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. Yeah, let's just go into one of these articles. So this is one of the studies incorporated into the literature review. In this study, they took two populations of rats. One was exposed to a high level of stress and trauma. The other was not. They were held in a safe and healthy environment. And while the results do show minor sex differences between the response to trauma on a neurophysiological level, the overall trend is consistent between each sex. The trend being that the trauma stress group shows persistent changes in gene expression, particularly in brain regions that were interested in human brains, not just in rat brains, being the hippocampus, the orbital frontal cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex. So that's that. To look in a human population, a similar study is done where we have two populations, one reporting a high number of adverse childhood experiences, the other reporting a low level of early childhood adverse experiences. And what is interesting is that when each group is presented with stressful stimuli and put in a stressful situation, the high adverse childhood experience population shows a higher stress reactivity in saliva samples and in blood tests. And what's found when we look at their DNA is that their glucocorticoid receptor genes are consistently methylated in a way that the lower adverse childhood experience group is not. So they are consistently showing a higher reactivity to stress due to that higher level of methylation. So that's another study there.
Oh, this is me. Okay, so right here we're kind of talking about this research that shows that in African cichlid fish, they were able to do this experiment where they found low status animals, and they were actually able to inject methylation. They were actually able to methylate their genes, and they found that these animals in low status were very statistically highly likely to ascend in social ranks. And in contrast, those with inhibited methylation or demethylation actually were statistically highly unlikely to ascend in rank, and they stayed there. This is just a picture of what I'm talking about. This is an African cichlid fish. And similar to these patterns within fish, we also see this in monkeys, that when we actually analyze even the physiology of the placenta of mothers of these rhesus monkeys, we see that there is an intergenerational transcription or transfer. We see that this methylation becomes almost hereditary, and then it's passed down intergenerationally. And so here, what we're talking about, though, this research by Saul Levine talks about how humans are actually a bit more complex. So with fish in that earlier slide, that's really predictable. We can do that kind of experiment. We can methylate fish and find these predictable outcomes because fish have relatively predictable lives. Humans actually are far more complex. We find ourselves with inner positions, for example, with attitude towards our environment, as opposed to just a constant reaction of what's going on. And we have language to add to our inner position as well, and we can play with that through that language. And so essentially what this does is this research just kind of shows how DNA methylation might happen to a human, but that actually has no real... We can't really predict whether that means that is going to be highly beneficial for the individual or will contribute towards negative health outcomes and socio-emotional outcomes.
Yeah, so with all this being said, we see the process of methylation being passed down from one generation to another. That methylation is consistently seen in the research as a response to adverse childhood effects. But to complicate the picture in the human realm, and the fact that we can take the stand of resiliency, this shows that there are different possibilities, there are different ways that humans can respond in their lives to their traumatic experiences. So a study called Childhood Adversities and Distress, the Role of Resilience in a Representative Sample, studies over 2,500 German citizens living in the country. And what they find is that the individuals who experienced a lot of trauma in early life, but holds the factors of resiliency and can take a coping stance of resiliency, that they actually show lower levels of distress and that they aren't developing the same negative health outcomes as people without those resilient factors. The way the researchers put it is that they don't express the same somatoform symptoms despite having the same experiences as other people. So resiliency seems to be a factor that can really change an outcome.
Yeah, so this is just even more reinforced by an article put out by the Minnesota Department of Health. So essentially what they're saying here is that toxic stress gained from adverse childhood experiences, for example, can actually be offset by protective factors that we see in the conversation about resiliency. So these might include a close relationship with caring adults, parent resilience, especially kind of when we're looking at that maternal passing down, caregiver knowledge and parenting skills, a sense of purpose or meaning, developmental competencies, and social emotional health, social connection, socioeconomic advantages, and caring and nurturing communities. So essentially, the reason why we're having this conversation is because, again, while even what we're bringing up we think is important, the research done by ACEs, as well as the kind of questions raised by people looking at factors such as resilience, all of this is meant to kind of just continue to develop and inform our understanding and approach towards clients. And it allows us to kind of continue to give the best possible care we can without making too many presumptions, too many decisions based off of preliminary information that we find out early in the process. It helps us treat our clients with respect and dignity that they deserve. So so here's some references.
We got them. Some good research.
Some APA format. And bada boom.
Thank you very much.
Any questions? Can't hear you, so. Okay.